Thank you very much indeed. Thank you, Gary. It's a fantastic honor to be giving a Martin Meyerson lecture. It's a terrific honor, too, to be part of the Monell Chemical Senses Center. It's kind of a tremendous, it's an institution of enormous respect to someone in my field, and great to be here for the first time. And great to be able to share my enthusiasm for encouraging people to think about humans as a little bit different from other animals. We're all too used to treating other animals as good models for humans, in particular in relationship to nutrition and taste and flavor. I'm not going to talk about taste and flavor much today at all, but I do want to focus on trying to think about humans as special. So this photograph here is, of course, a fantasy. This is a joke put together by David Bygott, who took the photograph of chimpanzees holding sticks that they'd formed into wands to allow ants to crawl up them so they could wipe the ants off and then eat the ants. But they did not actually make kebabs. Humans are the only species that cook. There are other species that farm and other species that use tools and that sort of thing, but cooking really is special. So I want to take us into a world of thinking about what makes humans different from a nutritional perspective. And we'll go through the topics on the left, thinking about the cooking hypothesis after we first of all think about apes as a useful background. And the reason that they are a useful deep background for this is because of this astonishing difference between the genetic evidence and the morphological evidence about our relationship to the apes. So you see the genetic evidence on the left, and you see the morphological evidence at the bottom. And the fact that gorillas, chimpanzees, and bonobos all look so much like each other, all walk on their knuckles, big black hairy things that eat fruit and leaves in the forest, all obviously suggested to people that they are the most closely related to each other. But in fact, it turns out that's not the case, and therefore, if we put the two kinds of evidence together, that is what we get. And when we then think about the animal that gave rise to humans, it's clear that it was in the gorilla, chimpanzee, bonobo mold. Unless there's been tremendous convergence among these living species from their common ancestors, it means that the species that gave rise to us about 5 or 6 million years ago was very much like a bonobo, chimpanzee, gorilla. And for reasons that I'm happy to defend in question time, I think a chimpanzee is the appropriate model based on what we know about these three different species. So with that, I want to just review some data about chimpanzee diets, which actually apply very similarly to bonobo diets. Here we are in the typical world of a chimpanzee, high up a tree, eating fruits which occupy something around 60–70% of their rather extensive feeding time. And they look very happy, often surrounded by large amounts of fruit, but of course they're highly selective. Only a few of these fruits will actually be eaten because there is a tremendous threshold to which they're very sensitive of the ones that are ripe enough to be worthwhile to eat. They also take a lot of eating, by the way. They're not like apples, oranges, and bananas. There's a lot of chewing that goes on. So when you go out and make your National Geographic movie of chimpanzees, you're rather disappointed to discover that the great majority of the time what you're doing is watching them chew. There are times when there are even more exciting foods than the fruits that occupy so much of their diet. And one of them is meat, which many people have thought has been important in the ancestral human diet. It may be important in many different ways, but one of the ways it's not important, if we look at the chimpanzee evidence, is in providing a rapidly eaten form of food. It takes about 5 hours for a chimpanzee to get 2,000 calories from eating raw meat. They sometimes eat honey, but honey is rare. It's very difficult to get. So very often they can't find these preferred foods, and what they end up eating is some of the fruits that are not that good. And then in the times of year when the fruits are relatively hard to find, then they are spending their time eating either leaves or the inner stems, the piths of various different kinds of acanthaceae, gingibraceae, gramineae, and so on. There are one or two other things I just might mention since I'm here, partly to respond to something that Gary said. They sometimes eat the rotten wood of a particular species of tree, Neobutonia, and there is quite a lot of evidence that this is a source of salt. Rotten wood appears to be a concentrating source of salt for a variety of primates. And then, just for interest, this is soil taken from the subhumus layer, which in the case on the left is taken from the roots of a fallen tree. And this is something that chimpanzees eat on a fairly regular basis. And we've recently established that pregnant females eat it more than non-pregnant females. So that's a really fascinating question from the point of view of how the perception system is responding to this during pregnancy. And of course, that's fascinating because it's something that is found in humans too, that the fact that pregnant women are the ones who are the most frequent eaters of clays has been well established from many parts around the world. Okay, so that's just a background for what our ancestors were probably eating something like 5 or 6 million years ago. And here are some of the consequences in terms of some simple summaries that people tend to focus on when they think about the differences in diet between ourselves and our closest relatives. Lots of fiber in the ape diets because of lots of very high fiber fruit as well as the high fiber foliage, and not much animal lipid or starch or honey. And those are the things, those last four are the things that dominate in the human diets. So traditionally, that has been very much the way that people think about the importance of human diets. But I want to now add what I think is even more important, and that is that we are the only species that processes our food in the sense of taking the stuff that we're actually going to eat and doing something to change its nature. So you get quite a lot of food processing in animals in the form of getting them to open a nut, to extract a seed, that sort of thing. But I don't know of any animal that has the equivalent of humans of processing food, unless maybe honeybees can be said to do it when they are creating honey. So cooking. It's long been established as a worldwide phenomenon. Here are data from hunters and gatherers around the world. It is the case that you do sometimes get places where raw meat can be eaten in the northern climes. That is largely when people are stuck out on the ice and unable to whip up a quick meal. It's quite clear that meals are preferred to be cooked from all sorts of evidence. And by the way, one of the consequences appears to be the fact that humans are saved a tremendous amount of chewing time, because in subsistence societies around the world that we have reviewed, we found that just as in America, people are spending more like 5% of their day, their 24 hours, actually chewing. So that changes things a lot. Okay, well now, here is a remarkable thing, I think. Levi-Strauss was a social anthropologist who had a view of the world which came from thinking about the way that people perceive their environment in relationship to nature. And he said that the reason that people cooked their food was for purely symbolic reasons. He said, we cook in order to establish the fact that we are different from other animals. And this was a popular book. Many of you may have come across it, The Raw and the Cooked. But what seems to be amazing about this conclusion, when he said that people do not have to cook their food, it's just symbolic, nobody disagreed with it. Nobody said, no, wait a minute, cooking actually is important. And you can see why, perhaps, because the standard wisdom is that humans are animals, and if animals don't need to cook their food, then why should humans need to cook their food? And after all, most of the foods that we eat are edible raw. They may not be as nice, and people say that to cook the food increases the flavor and makes it nicer to eat in various ways, but they are edible. And after all, there are raw foodists. There are urban raw foodists in pretty much every city that you can find. There will be some people who will be devoting themselves to eating all of their food raw.
So that would seem to make this fair enough. But here is the difference. There is a study by Corinna Kobnik and her colleagues from Gießen in Germany of almost 600 raw foodists. Now, if you look at chimpanzees, then like every other non-human animal, they are having babies just fine on their raw diets. Here are the data from raw foodists. These are self-reports. We still don't have any direct measures of ovarian function. But what the Kobnik and party found was that as the amount of food eaten raw increases to 100% of the diet, the aim of most raw foodists, then 50% of the women had amenorrhea. Their ovarian function had shut down completely, and this means that another 20 or 30% were also incapable of having a baby. And the remarkable thing about this is that the food that they are eating is extremely high quality compared to anything that is going to be eaten by an animal in the wild. Apart from anything else, unlike the Paleolithic, they're almost always using blenders and grinders to make smoothies. They normally allow themselves to dry the food up to about 114 degrees Fahrenheit. They're, of course, using extremely high-quality food in the sense that it's been domesticated. There's very low fiber in all the fruits that we find in the stores here compared to the fiber that you find in the wild. And there's higher sugar, too. They're eating a certain amount of meat. They're eating oil that has been pressed. It's non-seasonal. It's a global food resource, so they're able to get good food even during times of the year when locally there's not much. They can eat as much as they like, essentially, which is not the case if you're a hunter and gatherer, and they're not schlepping kilograms of food over several miles in order to bring it home. And yet, under all these ideal conditions, the average woman cannot have a baby. So that is the essential argument which says that humans are different from every other animal. We have adapted. What is going on? Here is a picture of a young woman, Angela, who is very proud of the fact that she has got thin on a raw diet. And she recommends this as a way to dodge the problems of obesity. She and many other animals could benefit in the same way. Our pets are now often obese, as was shown from a study a couple of years ago. There's, on the right here, I've got a picture of hedgehogs. And this animal, which is unfortunately rather threatened in the UK right now, I include because of the story on the BBC not long ago which said that people are giving so much food to the hedgehogs that they are getting too fat. And the food they're giving is bread, which has been cooked. And of course, the problem is that if you're a hedgehog, then the way that you defend yourself against foxes is to roll up in a ball. And if you get too fat, you can't roll up in a ball anymore, and the foxes can eat you. So now the hedgehogs are being put in baths and being made to swim in order to lose weight. Well, better if they just stuck to their raw diets in the first place. The obvious possibility for explaining why it is that a large amount of raw food in the diet leads to poor ovarian function in women is that there is not enough energy, and that is strongly supported by the limited data available on body mass index in relationship to the amount of raw food that is eaten. So here you see differences in body mass index, kilograms per meter squared, for those eating cooked and those eating raw, with the blue being men and the red being women. And you see there is a substantial difference here. People often wonder about the role of meat. Well, here we see that the cooked data are divided between those that eat meat and those that have been vegetarian for a number of years, and the meat eaters are a little bit better off in terms of their BMI, but not much. It's some overlap. And in the Kobnik study, which is the best one of the effects of meat, you see that there was no detectable effect among the raw foodists eating from 70% to 100%. I just want to mention about the raw diets that some people do succeed in having babies on raw diets, and then they sometimes bring them up. on raw diets after some breastfeeding. And this is a woman called Taylor Wells who blogs extensively. And she discovered that her children were extremely small, and then she stopped having them as raw food diet advocates and allowed them to eat cooked food, and then everything changed. They grew much faster. There is no systematic study of this problem of what happens to children brought up on raw diets, but there are a number of anecdotes which are very disturbing. Here is one where there was a child that died at the age of 5.5 months, and the coroner's ruling was death by malnutrition because it had been brought up on raw diets. And I do think that now that we have pretty good evidence that humans are different from every other animal, adapted to cooked food, we should take very seriously this as a problem of child cruelty, and we should have some kind of arrangement which would stop people from bringing up their children on raw diets. Okay, so the hypothesis that emerges from this is that humans need cooked food, that is a unique adaptation, as well as being incredibly important, because, of course, this implies that we have to have fire and much else about human adaptation. Now, let me explore the question of the effects of cooking. Mostly, if you look in the literature, classically people have said that cooking is nice because it enhances the flavor, it enables you to get at foods that otherwise might be poisonous, but there's incredibly little focus on the problem of energy. So when my colleagues and I started thinking about this about 15 years ago, we discovered that we had to do the lab work largely ourselves. We've looked at starch and meat and oil seeds, and I just want to give you a sample of the kind of evidence that we have been turning up with. It's obviously very difficult to use humans as an experimental animal, so we've used mice, and what you see here are sweet potatoes sliced into 4 conditions, raw and whole on the left, raw and pounded in the middle to check the effect of non-thermal processing, cooked and whole, and then cooked and pounded. And then the mice were given treatments of eating only one of those diets for 5 days at a time, and then there'll be a washout period on chow, and we looked at what happened. And here is a change in body mass during their periods on the diet, and you see that they lost weight on the raw diets, and they maintained weight on the cooked diets. So that turns out to be very much the pattern that we see elsewhere. Here we have it for meat. Well, let me just mention that some people were worried about whether or not it's fair to feed mice meat because they're not adapted to it. But I just mentioned this grisly case of mice in the South Atlantic that burrow into albatross chicks that have been left on their nests while mum goes off to collect food for days at a time. And they're immobile, and mice can burrow into them and eat them from within. And the enormous majority of their diet is meat. So on that basis, we felt it fair to feed meat, and here standardized in this case to the effect of energy on the raw whole diet, we see that, again, the cooked whole and the cooked pounded diets are the ones that are relatively energy-giving compared to those that are eaten raw whole or raw pounded. And in both the case of the tubers and the case of the meat here, we found that the significant results for the cooking, but not for the pounding. And then we've done this with a food that provides a way to get at the lipid content. So using peanuts, again, raw whole, raw pounded, cooked whole, cooked pounded, you see here presented in a different way that as the amount of energy taken in increases, so whether or not the food is cooked or raw, you get a greater change in body mass, but always more when the food is cooked, and that's for whole peanuts, and here you see it for blended peanuts. Very consistent set of results indicating that cooking is important. So then the question is, why? What is it actually doing? And I think there are going to be two main answers to this, and one is digestibility. So now it's been known for some time that if you take starchy foods, which are very important, of course, for humans worldwide, somewhere around 60% of food intake, if you take starchy foods, it's known that this leads to a faster increase in glucose in the blood following intake when they're cooked than when eaten raw. But I guess what people have not been certain about is essentially what happens to this curve. Is it possible that it really doesn't matter that you're getting a surge of glucose with cooked cornstarch, because in the end, maybe it's all digested? And when we first published about this, that's exactly the criticism that was made in print about this idea that we had that cooked cornstarch would give more energy, because they said, look, there's no starch coming out in the feces. You can look and see the starch grains, and there's none there. So it's all digested, so it doesn't matter whether it's fast or slow. At least it gets digested. Well, the thing is that that is an inappropriate use of the concept of digestibility, because if you think about the fact that our digestive systems include both the small intestine and the large intestine, and you think about the fact that in the large intestine, any starch that is being digested or fermented there is being partly used by the bacteria and partly used by us, then any of the starch that gets into the large intestine is going to be poorly used by us. So the way to get around this is to look at ileal digestibility, digestibility at the end of the ileum, using patients who, for one reason or another, have lost their colon and have the ileum brought to the surface of the abdomen, where it empties into a stoma, and a researcher can get at the contents every 15 minutes or 30 minutes or whatever it is. And using this, here are, I think, all the studies that have been published for humans of the effect on various starches of digestibility by the end of the ileum when eaten raw or eaten cooked. And what you see is, so the top one, green bananas eaten cooked, the digestibility is 99%, but eaten raw, just under 50%. These vary among the different wheats according to the structure of the starches, but overall, there is a huge impact. So, okay, so then some of the starch, when it's eaten raw, is getting into the colon. Now, how much of it benefits us directly, and how much of it is fermented and used essentially only by the microbiome? Well, the estimate is 50%. So that instead of getting 4 calories per gram from the small intestine, we're getting 2 calories per gram from the large intestine. And when you make that assumption, the median increase in digestibility is 30%, even though there's no starch coming out in the feces. You get a similar sort of result when people have looked, and this is the only ileostomy study I know, with protein. In this case, eggs, either scrambled or eaten raw, you get very similar results. And this has been repeated with healthy volunteers using isotopically labeled proteins and measuring the appearance of various gases in the breath. So again, it looks as though there is an important consequence of cooking for both starch and protein. We assume that the reason for this is denaturing of the proteins, making them more accessible. We've also been looking at plant lipids, and here we've got the result that may not apply to animal lipids. We still don't understand what's going on there, but with plant lipids, the lipids tend to be stored in oil bodies, shown on the right, which are surrounded by a protein, an oleosin, and what cooking is doing is disrupting the oleosin. So on the left, you see, for raw whole peanuts, a view of some oil bodies, and everything is covered in green, which is the protein, and then in the cooked protein, when the cooked peanuts, what you see is that the lipid stained in red has been released. So that suggests that it is access to the lipid that is important in the effects of cooking for lipids. Digestibility is only one of the effects. The other is the cost of digestion. And let me introduce this by this wonderful study which is not about cooking, but it is about one of the properties of cooking, namely the physical property of the food. So what Oka did was to look at the softness of pellets as an independent variable affecting the growth of rats. He took regular chow and he put them into two different states. One was the same density as regular chow, and the other was with air added. So it was reconstituted at twice the volume. The amount of water was the same, all of the nutrients, of course, were the same, because it was just like puffed wheat or something like that. And was able to monitor what was happening with these rats, making sure that he could control for the amount of food they ate, and therefore the number of calories, water intake, and he monitored their locomotion. And what you see is this result, which was that the ones on the soft diet, eating exactly the same number of calories, ended up significantly heavier as they approached adulthood, and they had 30% more body fat. So where does the difference come from? They were able to measure this. The difference came from the work that the body is doing during digestion, because those eating the soft diet had a lower change, a lower increase in metabolic rate as a consequence of eating. When the food was physically easier to eat, the body did less work. There's quite a range of studies of this sort of phenomenon, very little of it directly on cooking. We've done one on pythons with cooking, but recently we've done one on mammals for the first time. And working with rats, we've been able to look at the costs of digestion. And here what you see is that the cost of digestion falls from the left with the raw whole food towards the right with the cooked pounded food, both for meat and for tubers. And in both cases, what you see is that when you cook, you reduce the cost of digestion. The cost falling from, in the case of meat, from about 15, 16% to 8% of the value of the meal. So the meal can cost quite a lot to be digested, and reductions in that caused by a reduction in the physical integrity of the food is a significant saving. And in this case, there was an effect of pounding as well, which can explain why it is that very often in hunters and gatherers what you see is something like this. When meat is so tender the sinews will fall apart, it's usually crushed in a mortar. This is why we like hamburgers. We're getting an energetic gain both from the grinding of the meat and from the cooking of the meat. And who knows how important this is? Here is one observation that was made by Barr and Wright, suggesting that when you compare multigrain bread and cheddar cheese as the relatively indigestible food compared to white bread and processed cheese, then their measurements indicated 64 calories increase in the cost of digestion. So this suggests that there is a really big impact of the physical integrity of the food and the cost of digestion on net caloric intake. Okay, so that has been trying to explain why it is that cooking does have an effect on energy. What's going on with humans? Why are we different from every other animal? Just as in almost all aspects of this area, we still know incredibly little, but we do know some simple things about anatomy. So we begin with the fact that humans have got the smallest guts in relationship to body mass of any of the primates. And this is not because of the small intestine. The small intestine is as big as you expect it to be. It's because of the stomach and the cecum and the colon. And then in association with that, we have small molars. Small molars are adapted to eating relatively easily chewed stuff that is not so tough. And humans also have relatively weak and small jaw muscles. So the jaw muscles of a gorilla go right up to the top of its head and even beyond. They have special bones to enable insertion of these huge muscles. But in humans, it's weak. And just recently, it's been shown that the total bite force of humans is low. Here we have Homo sapiens, and it's been calculated for all the Homo to be low compared to the apes and the monkeys. So humans are apparently adapted to eating food that is presumably relatively easily digestible because we've got small guts, and easily chewed because we've got small teeth and weak jaws and small mouths, incidentally, as well. And then the fascinating question arises, well, how long has this been going on? And the standard wisdom, which I think is correct, is that if you look back over the Paleolithic, you find right at the beginning of the Paleolithic, 1.9 million years ago, you see the emergence of a species, Homo erectus, the first true Homo, that has a rib cage and pelvis that are like ours. And the size of these and the shape of them indicate that their guts were similar to the size of our guts nowadays. Whereas prior to that, there were flaring ribs and a wide pelvis, indicative of the wide, large kinds of guts that you find in chimpanzees, gorillas, and bonobos. And that was also the time when you have the biggest drop in the size of the teeth recorded in human evolution. So this is the species that is the first true Homo, Homo erectus, and here is the drop in tooth size from what's sometimes called Homo habilis, but I think it's better called Australopithecus habilis, its immediate apparent predecessor. So here is the sort of confusing situation about the timing of how long we have been adapted to eating highly digestible and easily chewed foods. If you look at the biological evidence that I've just been talking about, then down here you would say 1.9 million years ago, with the emergence of Homo erectus, which then eventually wound its way through to becoming Homo sapiens, that was when we became adapted to eating cooked food. But if you look at the archaeological evidence, you only go back about 250,000 years, and then the consistent evidence of the control of fire starts giving out, and it becomes spotty as you go further back during the Paleolithic. And so the conservative approach from archaeologists is to say that cooking has only been 250,000 years old. But either way, it's old enough. Either way, it would make sense that our species has been relying on cooked food for many generations and sufficient time to adapt our bodies and our physiology, about which we know so little in relationship to this point. Now, I'm not saying that we have evolved to like cooked food. We've tested great apes, and they like their food cooked too. So do mice, so do rats, and so do dogs. All animals seem to like it cooked. So we seem to be tapping into a pre-adapted system whereby we are good at perceiving food that will be easily digested and will have low costs of digestion. So questions that seem to me to be not affected by the view of humans as adapted to cooked food are things like, how does cooking change the food quality, and why is it that we like cooked food? Because those are going to apply to other animals as well. But there are questions, I think, that are affected by this view of humans as being different from every other animal. How is it and why is it that human perceptions of food differ from animal models? We don't know about that yet, but we can expect that it might be the case. What effect do potentially negative products of cooking, such as Maillard compounds, have in human diets? Now, I want to draw attention to this because it seems like an interesting area. In the Maillard process, which is almost entirely the result of the application of heat to foods that have got some reducing sugars and some amino acids, then you get this complicated production of thousands of different compounds, which are mostly regarded as extremely bad for us because you typically get evidence that they are carcinogens. And yet humans have been eating them for maybe 250,000 years, maybe 1.9 million years. So are humans differently adapted from other species? And I think there is some evidence that Maillard compounds that have been found to be carcinogenic in other species are not in humans. So here's another question. Why do we like their flavors at all? Harold McGee has suggested that the reason that we like Maillard compounds is just that they happen to be similar to those that occur in fruits, and it's just a coincidence. Here's another possibility. Although male compounds are produced in much higher amounts, once you are putting your food on a fire, they are produced at a low rate, in low concentration, as natural part of decay, and maybe we like them because decaying foods are easier to digest, and that way we can find foods that are good for us. Maybe there's no adaptive story, we're learning it in our mother's milk. But I like the idea that we should explore that the male compounds that are most predictably found in cooked food, we should have adapted to them. We should be predisposed to like them, and we can expect that they should be much less harmful to us than they are in other species. Let me just mention one other aspect of why this matters. From what I've been saying, you should be able to answer this question. How many calories are there in a raw sausage and a cooked sausage? And I confidently went to my local supermarket and found a package of sausages, and it gave me the numbers for how much calories there would be in them raw and cooked. And here was the answer. That is what you find on the back of a pack of sausages, and it's what you find when you go to the USDA website. If you ask what is the value of food, raw or cooked, then what the labeling system in this country and pretty much worldwide will tell you is that if there is any consequence of cooking, it is that it will be slightly less food, less calories that you will get than eaten raw. And the reason in this case is dripping losses. I think that it's very unlikely that that is really true, even for the sausage with the dripping loss, and I'm sure that it's not true for many foods in which dripping losses do not occur. And this seems to me to be a public health issue, because we ought to know more about the consequences of cooking. We ought to know more about whether or not we are going to gain more or less eating our food cooked or raw, than being told at the moment that it doesn't make any difference, or you're going to get a decline in eating cooked food. I think the experience of the raw foodists is very clear and very consistent, and it means that if people are trying to gain weight, then they should know that cooked food is better, and if they're trying to lose weight, they should know that raw food is better. So I think there are issues that rise above the level of the biological anthropology, as it were. I think if we're going to have a well-informed public, it's time to recognize that just as fleas are adapted to eating blood, and dolphins to eating fish, and giraffes to eating leaves, humans are adapted to something. We're adapted to eating cooked food. We can't get away without it unless we are incredibly privileged urban raw foodists with amazing access to the best kinds of raw foods that you can imagine. And this has implications, it seems to me, for the way that we should approach the science of human nutrition and the way that we should think about public health issues. So with that, I'd like to say thank you to the colleagues that have joined me on this journey in the past, and to Gary and the Nobel Chemical Senses Center for coming here today. Thank you very much.